by the IDESCAT as an official data is 11,365 euros. The difference is very important, 426 euros. For basic income model is a very important difference. So we need to be aware of the differences that this can mean in terms of the results. I would like to say, because this is an important thing to bear in mind, that in the case of the determination done by the INE or the IDESCAT, well, in all cases, they are working with a sample of 6,769 people, whereas the result obtained through the tax sample is working with information related to more than 363,000 people. So the statistical strength of those results is biased towards the tax agency. So we are speaking of 54 times more information that we get as compared to the living conditions survey. Third point, which is important for us to bear in mind before we comment on the results of a basic income model. And I've called this the cost of not having a basic income. As you can see here, we have two tables, one related on poverty aspects. I believe that everyone here more or less is familiar with this information. Then the table that we have at the right-hand side talks about progressivity and redistribution. When it comes to poverty, I don't want to go into details, but we are saying what threshold are we going to use. It's about 19% or 21% of households that are below the poverty threshold or at risk of poverty. And if we translate this for severe poverty, this would be half, more or less half of those percentages. And if we introduce the concept in terms of individuals that consider themselves to be poor, the percentages increase between 30–33%, and in adults, it's around 19 and 21%.
So let me insist, these are figures you probably know that can be known through the INE website or the IDESCAT website. Maybe it would be more interesting to talk about the table on the right, one about inequalities, where you have the Gini index for gross income and the Gini index for net income. And where we see values in both cases that, as seen on the remarks, you can see underneath that this is at the tail in all cases of the European Union. So there's a huge degree of inequality in the distribution of our income. We have also included a not so well done index that measures the progressivity of taxation. I mean the personal income tax. We see that the progressivity of this tax is quite significant, but on the other hand, it is not able to redistribute income as the one we would be able to accept. So a concept that we normally use, which is the redistributive effect, we would say that either if we use one information or the other, this effect doesn't go beyond 4%. So once taxes have been paid, the income transfer among the rich and poor segments of the population doesn't go beyond 4%. This is the structure of the personal income tax in Spain, and which questions its capacity to distribute wealth. And finally, we have another figure related to wealth and the property or the equity of households. We have used the Gini index for this income, that is gross and net income, and the values are really high in our case. This means this is a worldwide trend, which is wealth concentration, that in the last 20 years have been increasing everywhere. And of course, Catalonia is not an exception. One last remark on this table. There's a huge difference between the gross Gini income when we analyze this based on data provided by the Inland Revenue or on the Living Conditions Survey, because high income levels in the Living Conditions Survey are not correctly measured. When we incorporate them, which the tax sample does, inequalities come to the surface more significantly. One of the interesting questions that the taxation sample provides is the possibility not only to know the income, but also to be able to know the equity or wealth of people, something that the Living Conditions Survey doesn't allow because it doesn't provide information on that. What I've done here is to provide a title like this. It is more and more indispensable to have a tax on wealth, because this is a way to ensure that inequalities and low redistribution obtained can be modified in a way that is desired by all. We have analyzed the period from 2016 to 2019, and we have broken down the figures between income and equity, personal equity. We have analyzed the absolute growth and percentual growth of different groups of the population. In the first case, we have the total population, and in the second case, what we call 10%, the wealthiest 10% of the population, either in terms of income or equity. The conclusions are highlighted on this table. We could give you details on this. In terms of gross income, the increase is 13.5 during this period. In terms of wealth, this growth has gone up 8% in terms of the total equity, the global equity. But if we focus on the growth of this 10% wealthiest group, this growth vary in a more significant way, that is 14 and 12% respectively. If we go one step further and we correlate this to percentual increases, we find out that in terms of gross income, groups representing the wealthiest 10% of the population ends up receiving 20% of this absolute growth. But if we focus on this on terms of wealth, we see that this 10% has 64% of this absolute growth. Figures don't reflect nothing else that what we all know, but they show this clearly in our territory in Catalonia. There is a concentration, a higher and higher concentration of wealth and of income as well, and more in the top part of any of those two distributions. I don't want to go into much detail on this because Lluís Torrens will provide more information on this. We have another table that is interesting regarding net equity, where we have ordered from the least rich to the richest and divided this in groups. And we see that the wealthiest 2% in terms of equity, the row corresponding to 100%, this group has, on average, a value that multiplies by more than 22 times the average of the average global equity in Catalonia. Maybe Piketty or Thuman would tell us that these groups need to be taxed with tax on wealth. Another important figure that focus on the group that we need to pay attention. This last table provides an intersection between this 10% of the wealthiest part of the population in terms of income and the wealthiest fraction in terms of equity. This is the intersection of these two 10% of the population. This is around 260,000 people in Catalonia. This group concentrates 172 million euros of net equity and have an average equity around 650,000 euros, which is twice the average of the global net equity in Catalonia. The conclusion is, to wrap up this section, that the proposal to introduce a tax on wealth needs to focus on this group of population. This group needs to be taxed, and this tax needs to be calculated based on the indications of the pundits on this subject matter, around at least 2 and 5%. We will see this in more detail later, and we will see the impacts this could have on the funding of basic income. Next, let me point out the features of our model. This basic income replaces any other benefits provided by the state, pensions, employment benefits, etc., up to the amount of the basic income are considered basic income, and the rest are perceived as perceived in this model. Basic income is not taxed by the personal income tax. There's a period of 3 years of residency in order to be able to receive this basic income. Funding is achieved through our reformation of the personal income tax, the introduction of wealth tax, and also on top of that, other modifications that could be carried out in terms of successions taxation and environmental taxation, which will be mentioned by Lluís Torrens later. An important aspect is that basic income doesn't deduct any monies from the monies that Catalonia or the state or Catalonia, if it becomes independent, could use to maintain its welfare state. That's healthcare and education. Basically, this is not modified. The basic income doesn't take any funding from these other services. Just two last points I would like to highlight. What is the amount we've been working on in our model? This model has worked with different proposals, and one of the proposals we've been working on has been highlighted by the advice committee. This option entails defining the basic income as the poverty threshold. So using the tax sample we mentioned before, so it's 2,039 euros. This income is received by a household depending on the composition of the household. This is mentioned in the example. A household with 2 adults and 2 minors would receive 22,972 euros per year. So that's multiplying by 2.1, which is the equivalence scale for this household. 1 for the first adult, 0.5 for the second person above 13, and 0.3 for each minor under 14. This would be the income that would be transferred to the household or living unity. We don't make a distinction between household and living unity. Finally, we understand that this basic income is an individual benefit. So one thing is how you determine transfer of this benefit to the household, and another thing is how this is perceived by each of the individuals in this household. So once we have defined the benefit for that household, each individual in that household will receive the percentual corresponding part, with the exception of minors under 18, which depend on the decisions by their parents or tutors. How am I doing time-wise? I've exceeded my time? Okay. So let's move on to the results. Main results of our model: 44% tax rate for all incomes received by citizens. This rate guarantees a part of the funding of the basic income scheme, the main part, an important part of this funding. Tax on wealth that replaces the current tax on equity that currently in Catalonia is collecting more than 500 million, but the proposal in our model would imply collecting almost 10 times more, around 5,000 million. This allows us to fund the compensation costs, which I will describe later, and the poverty eradication cost, and also generates a surplus of around 1,900 million euros that could be used to offset the deficit generated by this model. This tax would only be applied to the wealthiest 10% of population in terms of income and equity. In terms of winners, this model provides 84.7% of winning households. In terms of individuals, this provides 69.35% of adult winners. This doesn't include people under 18. The Gini index I mentioned before falls to 0.24 versus 0.497 we had for the gross income. So we would find ourselves within the most equalitarian levels in the world. The redistributive effect, which I mentioned at the beginning, becomes 0.1674. So this modifies the percentage we mentioned at the beginning. And the deficit generated by this model that needs to be funded through other taxes, which Lluís Torrens will mention later, goes around 3,000 million euros. Two graphics illustrating the results. Here we have taxation rates, effective taxation rates. The first column is before, the black line. The second column is the after column in blue. And here we see the results in terms of progressivity generated by a basic income model as the one we have mentioned. And finally, one last table that also illustrates these results, a comparison of the losses per household over 10 years, around 80% in terms of income. All the groups are winners, and from this 80% percentile, we start having the losers. So the funding is based on this 20% of losers to benefit 80% of the population. This is all I wanted to say. I'm sorry that I have exceeded my time, and Lluís Torrens will continue my explanation. Let me continue. I think I will be on time because I have less things to explain, because the most important part has been already explained. Let me give you a bit of context on this reflection on other models that we did before, where everything was based on the personal income tax. The first one is that we want to propose models that propose feasible things. So far, these proposals were based on two sources. The first would be savings in public benefits under the basic income. These are included in this basic income, and of these, 90% are pensions and benefits and employment benefits and subsidies and autonomic minimal incomes. And later, a reform of the personal income tax that simplifies it in the sense of eliminating minimal thresholds and reduction. Some of them are regressive, unifying general and saving rates with one single tax rate and with several types under a progressive scale. Why would we undertake different possibilities apart from personal income tax? Well, the simulations we have done allow us to implement models where 80% of the population or more, was 84 in this case, are winners or stays the same. 50% are clear winners, 30% stays the same or wins a little bit, and 20% losers. But as you can see on the last graph, this is concentrated around the 2 or 5% of the wealthiest segment of the population. Using the personal income tax as a tax basis, and as this is currently measured based on current regulations, has some issues. First, it focuses taxation on incomes from work and economic activities, and not on the increase of wealth on the speculation. There's a double taxation on general income, working income, and there's a lower, which is 26% maximum on surpluses or dividends and interests. It is true, Jordi provides the progressive graphic, that a single tax rate combined with a basic income is more progressive than the current personal income tax situation. But it's not very popular because it doesn't look like popular. Well, it's not progressive if you don't combine it, but if you combine it, it's much more progressive than the current model. A third element would be that in the current situation we have in Catalonia, we don't have all the regulatory capacity to modify the personal income tax. There's one aspect that is important here. We cannot change the capital income taxation. This is not in our competence. We cannot modify these rates from the local government. Fortunately, in here, this represents only 4.4% of the taxation base. That explains that the highest incomes and equities represent an important part of the growth of the country, but they only contribute 4.4% to the global taxation income. But we can check this based on the figures provided by the Bank of Spain and the inheritance taxes. These figures tell us that the current taxation model is not enough to revert the increase in accumulation of wealth in the wealthiest segment of the population. The latest figures tell us at the national level, tell us that the 10th percent wealthiest part of the population has gone from 44% to 53% of the total wealth of Catalonia. This is the same trend that's going on in most of the countries, but there's a progressive accumulation of wealth in these groups. These groups are also increasing, and at the same time, the wealth of the lowest strata, the population, are decreasing. So there's a transfer of wealth towards the top wealthiest parts of the population. Based on this situation, considering that the personal income tax would be the only solution, well, it's not fair. It could have been if the tax rate was 50%, and then the problem would be solved. But we need to provide new models. Fortunately, models where the Catalan government has competencies. In some areas, at least, we must think of other models of funding combined with the personal income tax that allow us to reduce this single tax rate, this marginal tax rate, and bearing in mind that each point increase or reduce implies 1,300 thousand euros of taxation. So let's see where we would be with this model. This is the complicated personal income tax table, combining the national and the autonomic scales. When you combine them, there are very weird changes or drops. We would be between the green and yellow areas. 44% of the rates applicable, this is the marginal rate applied to incomes above 60,000 euros. So if you earn more than 60,000 euros, your tax rate is 44%. Above that, there are 4 more stages ending with 50%. This is the last one. When negotiating the national budgets, at least with this table, we find ourselves around the middle. We are proposing a model where we reduce the taxation rates for these higher incomes so that the marginal income doesn't have this disincentivation effect than the current model. We don't want to go lower because we need to fund a big part of it, but we find ourselves in the middle, more or less. Based on this tax rate of 44%, what needs do we have in this first scenario to fund a basic income calculated based on the OCDE method modified? We basically need to take account of 2 aspects, wealth tax and an inheritance tax.
Incrementar la recaptació amb gairebé 5.000 milions d'euros.
This would mean 5 billion euros more. And the second aspect is to cover the deficit that we do not cover with these 2 taxes and with the personal income tax, with other taxes that would allow us to also comply with other criteria, such as to remove poverty, so make sure that everyone is above the poverty threshold, and second, that there aren't any losers, so that no taxpayer is below the 80 percentile that is now worst off, and this will be 3.3 billion. About the inheritance tax, data say that the tax system in Catalonia in 28 it experienced one first decrease that was applied in 29. There was a further decrease in 2011-2012, but then it has gone up again. However, the mean effective rate for the inheritance tax in 2008 was 8.69%, and in 2020, 4 points less on the tax base. So, if we would have used the rates of 28, we would have had many 80 billion more. So that's well, we use data from 28. About the donations tax, the decrease was lower and the loss was 15 billion. The total that we have lost because of the de-taxing of the different proposals and the different legal changes, it's 702 million euros. And who pays that? Well, according to our studies and the government studies, 54% of the heritage that is inherited concentrated in 2016 on the richest 10%. So the richest 10% represented 10% of the inheritances. And then 53% of the net wealth is in the hands of the richest 10%. So it's around 54%. But if we only consider, as Jordi said, the 10% that has a higher income, so just the subgroup of those who have the highest income, they concentrate 42%. This is 3/4 of the total and 3/4 of the total. This 42% we applied to the 700 million, and excuse me for all these numbers and calculations, but we are saying that there are 303 million in terms of the inheritance tax that is paid by those richest in terms of heritage and in terms of personal income. So we have 300 million coming from this part of the population. Now, the tax on wealth. So if we keep this percentage of the richest 10%. So if we consider all the taxes, well, there is, it's capped, so that no one says that this is an expropriation. So in this case, this is 85%. It's capped at 85%. So you cannot pay more than 85% of what you have earned in the previous year with those taxes. So in order to get this 4.9 billion, without taking into consideration the inheritance tax, well, we will have 4.6 billion. So in order to get this money, what tax we would need to apply? And here you have two examples. This would be the effective rate that would have to be paid after having applied this caps at 85%. So it is around, well, the richest 2% that has the highest income 2% would pay 2.25%, whereas the others would pay between 1.9 and 1.1. Is this a very high figure? Well, let's put it in context. The Piketty's book, in this book, he suggests several things and measures for young people. Well, he says that an individual who has 10 times more the average equity would need to pay 5%, and we are suggesting 2 and something. So then 2%. So we are below the Piketty's proposals. So the wealth of 10% of the richest 10% is 12 times the mean wealth. But then we see also that the richest 2% has 22 times this wealth. So they would need to be paid more than 5% to guarantee the stability in our system to avoid the wealth accumulating in their hands. That's what's happening now, actually. So there is this contribution to reducing the accumulation of wealth. And so the effect is not just to fund the basic income, but also to improve this redistribution. And now we have that the richest income has a growth of more than 10%, so we need to make sure that the system is not collapsing. Now, if we see the increase in terms of assets, we see an increase of 10 billion per year. So telling those people that they need to pay 0.48 billion in terms of equity tax, this means that we are like applying on them 47% of all the increase. So we are getting to the core of the problem, and this would allow us to stop this concentration process. Okay, now I'm reaching to the end. We need 3.3 billion additionally to fund the basic income, and here we suggest 4 things. So first, those so the idea is that everyone who should pay this inheritance tax would pay it. So in order to get the money that we would need, the rest of people who are paying this inheritance tax would pay 390 million. On the other hand, we know that now households have had new incomes because of some measures that did not exist in 2019. So we should take this into account. And this has been 291 million. There has been this huge effort by the Spanish and Catalan administration to injecting more resources. Then we propose a light increase of IBI of 6%. This is the real estate tax to also benefit municipalities. So 6% increase for this real estate tax. It's not exaggerated in our view. And then using the data of the expert book that has been published recently in Spain, they suggest that in Catalonia we should get, in terms of taxes, 2.1 billion. What does this book say? Well, it establishes minimum levels and maximum levels around taxes, and so it covers fuels, emissions, and they suggest between 8 and 16 billion euros for all Spain. If we apply the mean between the minimum and the maximum, and if we apply this in Catalonia, taking into account our situation here, we can say that in Catalonia that would be 1.3, 1.9 billion, but that mean would be 2.18 billion in terms of funding. So we have taken an average figure based on what experts are suggesting. Two last considerations about what can make this funding need be more important or less important. Okay. One idea, for example, would be that the basic income would be submitted to the personal income tax or until the minimum limit. So if you have a higher income, this basic income would need to be subject to this personal income tax. So in Catalonia, we cannot modify the maximum rate of 26%. Here, there is an implicit loss of 1 billion euros in terms of collection, tax collection. Then there are other models. For example, 664 euros, this would mean 1.7 additional billion euros. So one more point in terms of the personal income tax. And also the modifications about the number of years that you need to be living here in Catalonia to get this basic income. This would have an impact on costs. And of course, we do not have all the tools. As a country, we don't have all the tax sovereignty that would allow us to find other funding possibilities. And here, two last things. The white book paper on tax reform proposes an exercise which is to progressively remove all the reduced and super reduced rates for VAT. This would mean, in the case of Spain, 27 more billion in terms of tax collection. In Catalonia, that would be between 4.3 and 5 billion. And we could compensate families. And this would mean 1.6 billion euros. So here we could generate between 2.8 and 3.5 billion additional euros, and this would help us with the other needs of funding. The same thing if we would eliminate the exemptions for financial services. This is another recommendation. This would mean between 450 and 530 million in terms of funds. They also propose to increase taxes on alcohol and cigarettes. So now we don't have the possibility of adopting this, but we see that there are alternatives. And 3 recommendations that are included in the report of this white paper that are very important and interesting, because implicitly they are recognizing that it would be very interesting to introduce something which would be like a negative personal income tax. So introducing refundable reductions. So then the mandatory nature of the personal income tax. So everyone needs to do that with a tax agency. And about the potential consequences, well, they also say that we should apply the North American regulation. So if you want to keep the American nationality, you need to do those declarations even if you don't live there anymore. And you need to pay the difference between one country and the other. If you want to renounce to the American nationality, there is a clause, and you also need to pay a sanction. And finally, the alternative measures for the business tax. And if we guarantee a minimum rate of 15%, this would mean 9 billion in Spain and 1.7 billion in the case of Catalonia. And that's all. Thank you.
Bé, moltes gràcies. Gràcies a Jordi i Lluís per les vostres presentacions.
Thank you, Jordi and Lluís, for your presentations. My presentation would be shorter. I'll be quicker. And it will be quite different. So I need to say that I agree what Mark said this morning to avoid any misinterpretation of what I would like to explain. Quickly, a small introduction. You know that the interest on basic income has increased a lot these recent years. What until recently was demonized as a very radical proposal is becoming today a potential proposal and a feasible proposal. The crisis in 28 gave rise to this proposal, but now, after the COVID pandemic, many governments have adopted measures that would be unimaginable and directly or indirectly have been related to this basic income. According to the World Bank, in 2020, 28 countries implemented new economic benefits with an unconditional character. Countries such as Argentina, Colombia, or Mexico, or Brazil reinforced their existing programs or created new income programs. In the US, the stimulation package mobilized around $3 billion that became partially in a kind of de facto basic income. Even the Financial Times, which is not radical at all, defended in April 2020, in the midst of the pandemics, that policies that were considered eccentric, such as the basic income, should be considered seriously. Now we make a leap. In Catalonia, we have this income since September 2017, whereas in the rest of the state, this was approved in 2020. These two programs, as most of the minimal benefits have many technical issues and also ethical issues. And in our experience, we were not able to overcome that. The situation is really pessimistic. Three figures to show that. First, it is estimated that the new demands is around 40 and 60% in the UE, in EU. This means that between 40 and 60% of individuals that could ask for this income is not asking for them, are not asking for them. I don't think that this is because they rationally decide not to ask for those benefits. I rather think that there are very important administrative problems and a lack of information by the administrations. Second, illustrative figure. The probability of that an unemployed person is getting this type of income today is 1.15%, whereas in 2011 that was 2.2%. So this is a reduction of around 50% in the last 10 years, the toughest years of the crisis. And third illustrative example, because I just mentioned unemployed people. Now let's talk about people living below the poverty threshold. Only 9.15% in Spain are getting some type of basic income. It's only 12.3% in Catalonia. These are very bad figures. Now, let's talk about the basic income pilot scheme. I will be speaking about pilot schemes, experiments, and experimental projects, if you allow me. This is in the sake of the language. So, the impact of the crisis in 2008 or the crisis in 2019, but increasingly more governments are realizing that their traditional schemes show deficits in terms of their operation, and the results are really scarce. And so the mechanisms for social protection are not well adapted to respond to the new ways of exclusion and of poverty in the 21st century. That's why many of those governments are prioritizing the largely called evidence-based policy with the objective of testing innovative solutions that can be more effective. And that's why there is this bigger interest on the basic income. Some examples, I think that Sergi Raventós mentioned them already, but for example, we see some basic income experimental schemes are taking place or will take place in countries such as Namibia, Uganda, Macau, Southern Korea, Brazil, Barcelona, the Netherlands, Canada, UK, Germany, France. However, and because of the popularity of those experimental programs, some time ago in the academia, there is a kind of skepticism growing because they ask whether it is really appropriate to continue with those pilot schemes on basic income. And I think this is the $1 million question. Haven't we accumulated enough empirical evidence to prove that basic income has positive results? If our final objective is to have such a basic income, is it really necessary to continue testing it? I think these are the appropriate questions. So with the time that I still have, and I will be quick, I will try to answer to those questions, and I will share with you 3 reasons why I think that it is not necessary to continue experimenting with the basic income. And that's why I said that. However, I agree with what Mark said at the beginning. Maybe if it seems paradoxical, what I want is to highlight the fact that maybe the mistake is in the question itself. This is why the question that we should be asking ourselves is not whether these pilot schemes are really necessary, but rather whether they are helpful, in what sense, and if so, to what extent. If the question is whether these experiences are necessary, my answer would be no, they are not necessary. After this introduction, well, this is the first part of my presentation. Briefly, now, I would like to focus on the three main reasons why I believe that we can justify this negative answer. The first reason, the first argument is an ethical one. The second one is an empirical one, and the third one is an epistemologic one. So, first argument, the ethical reason. Ethics come always first. Before any type of consideration of any nature, the main justification to implement the basic income is always ethical. In other words, the justification to defend this basic income depends on ethical reasons that cannot be verified empirically. So, as with poverty and slavery, this is something that is against the human nature. In this case, we could say in a society as ours, it is morally unacceptable that some people do not have the minimum resources to meet their needs, their basic needs. It's the same that happens with slavery. Of course, in a diverse society, we would all agree to say that it is not morally acceptable that some people, or many people, just because of the color of their skin, do not have their basic rights guaranteed. Could you imagine that someone would ask Martin Luther King to participate in a pilot scheme to verify whether the impact of reducing slavery is appropriate in statistical terms? So the justification for the basic income and also for the slavery, this does not depend on empirical evidences, but this is a measure which is ethically desirable because this could put an end to a problem, the poverty, that we socially identify as something humiliating for human nature. It's true that there might be other measures capable to respond to this moral challenge around poverty, but it doesn't exclude this measure, the justification for this measure. So the first justification is always ethical. Second reason why those experiments could not be necessary anymore in order to get closer to this scenario of a basic income. This one is related to the potential counterproductive effects that these experiments could have. That's a paradox. This is not that those experiments are not necessary, but they can be counterproductive. And they can be so in three different senses. First, they can represent a distraction because they could take some time from other campaigns. Secondly, experiments can also put obstacles to political dynamics that we could implement. Since these pilot schemes prioritize the logics of scientific assessment, the parameters through which political standard processes operate, well, this could be disrupted by dynamics where the traditional political actors would risk losing their incidence capacity in favor of scientific processes, apparently neutral, and so this would be only limited to some non-political experts. Thirdly, those experiments can even be negative or could have negative effects. So the possibilities of so these can be harmful or damaging. That was the case with some pilot schemes back in the 60s or the 70s, where the insignificant results of such schemes had this damaging effect, and so this was negative for the popularity of the basic income in some countries. Now, third reason why we can say that these experiments are not strictly necessary, and it is linked to the epistemological validation. So this is an old discussion, as old as science. So, as Mr. Banerjee recently said, and also other scientists, such as Nancy Cartwright, the methodology of the aleatorization in a controlled way, on which most of the basic income pilot schemes are based. So those pilot schemes that select a subgroup of the population to apply to them a treatment and to compare later the results. So this methodology should have a lower external validation because their results can't be generally replicated in other bigger contexts. As an alternative, other microsimulations or laboratory tests have been selected. So this validation depends always on an artificial context, as our speaker, Mr. The Whisperer, has written about. And so this is based on the hypothetical answers that we assume that they will take in this context. And this is always an exercise that has many limitations and epistemological controversies. So in conclusion, the problem is that the epistemical validation of these experiments will never be robust enough to justify by itself the adoption of a basic income from a point of view based on the scientific evidence. So we have seen that this does not depend on these empirical reasons, then that experiments can be counterproductive even in this case, and that the robustness of the results of those tests is always questionable from the epistemological point of view. Maybe you are thinking that I'm here basically criticizing those experiments and that I'm doing this in a working seminar on one of these pilots and I'm taking part of it. No, this is not my will here. Several researchers suggest that there is a correlation between those countries where these experiments have taken place and the degree of acceptation by the population.
We might expect that these places where we should be finding an implementation of this basic income, or that this proposal is closer to time than in other regions where this has not been tested. These hypotheses make us defend that the right question we should be asking is not rather that the experiments are not necessary, or rather that whether or not they're useful and to what extent. And this is the second part of my intervention, saying that these tests can be really indeed useful. There are two factors that through which we can defend the usefulness of these experiments. One factor is the scientific usefulness, and the other one is the political one. The first one, scientific usefulness, we can extract from empirical evidence. From the scientific point of view, experiments can be useful to the extent their results are enough positive and significant in order to convince those people that don't have an opinion on basic income, or that honestly are willing to change their points of view and opinions if they are shown, they are presented with sufficiently relevant evidence to change their opinion. This is the first usefulness of these pilot tests. And let me value this. Qualitative results of these tests have been superior and more significant than the results on the labor market. For example, these effects on the labor market gain all the social and media focus generated by the experiments. This asymmetry in the social perception of the experimental results suggests that there's a limited usefulness of empirical and scientific reasoning as the main reasonings to justify the implementation of a measure such as the basic income. Karl Luederkis defends that the greatest disagreement on the effects of the basic income has to do with its ethical implications rather than the empirical nature or the existence of these effects themselves. In other words, the evidence that an experiment can provide is not enough to convince someone that the implications of a basic income. We can say this also, saying that the controversy is not around the existence or validity or significance of the effects, experimental effects, but around the desirability, the ethical or regulatory desirability of these effects or impacts. Let me give you a recent example, the case of Finland. The question here is not whether or not the people receiving a basic income will be working more or less. The question is whether or not it is acceptable socially that people work less hours. And here is where the focus should be. First, experiments are useful to advance towards a basic income to the extent that results are quantitatively significant. In spite of this usefulness, scientific usefulness, is limited to those who have a logical reasoning and that are willing to change their point of view if the evidence is convincing. The problem here is that the social debate is not characterized by a calm discussion. Let's admit that only in specific exceptions, people don't provide logic arguments based on scientific arguments, but rather to reinforce our intuitions and to dismiss those that challenge our principles or ethical basic beliefs. As Saras Dabala, one of the responsibles of the experiments carried out in India, policies, as much as social experiments, are judged through the lens of ethics. And what I'm saying is not catastrophic, because in the end, the fact that empirical evidence cannot be detached of its ethical and moral and political implications helps us or leads us to question the nature and functioning of our social policies and the general overall functioning of welfare state mechanisms. Are we obliged to fulfill specific conditions in order to have social subsidies? Material existence should be an unconditionally ensured right. The unconditionality of the basic income goes against the social contract of reciprocity. So based on these possible questions that may rise, we may not continue to see these tests as a scientific initiative empty of ethical implications. These experiments are scientific, I agree, but they have a political usefulness because they have implications that go beyond the limits of academics and experimental science. And this is my last point, the political usefulness of experiments. These experiments need to be seen as a component of political strategy, as a tool, a lobbying tool, rather than a neutral observation source to inform the academic debate. To make this political nature explicit of pilot tests, we need to see a second role they can play on the advancements towards a basic role, which is the political role. If the objectives we're seeking with a pilot test is not only to have empirical evidence in a neutrally political way, but to advance towards the basic income, this pilot can help us to do it efficiently and minimize the negative risks that could arise when adapting this policy in an institutional and core cultural environment. We have some examples of this. The case of the cancellation, the sudden cancellation of the pilot in Finland shows to what extent pilots have a political nature and are subject to the threats and limitations as political actions themselves. Or another case, the case of Stockton, shows us how this scheme can coexist with other schemes of a national level. The case of Namibia showcase that the basic income can be incentive to promote political objectives such as the repopulation of certain deserted areas or the indebtedness of the most poor populations. And a negative example in terms of ethics is the case of Iran. In this case, this shows how the apparently neutral and scientific design of economic benefit is highly sensitive to, in political terms, because it can reinforce power asymmetries, domestic asymmetries, if this benefit is not individual, but family-based, and this is attributed to the man, not the woman. Just 1 minute. And also a case in Brazil, this experimental scheme can generate that inconditionality promotes socio-political empowerment of poor populations, so that the efforts of by Bolsonaro to eradicate this was not fruitful to give a vote to their constituencies. Ethical superiority and the counterproductive problems of this test question the need to continue to experiment with this. But this doesn't imply that experiments are not useful. They are, and they can be very useful. Empirical evidence will be always useful in scientific terms, but this usefulness is limited to convince part of the population or those willing to change their minds. If this scientific usefulness is null compared to the political usefulness, recognizing it allows us to discover the political usefulness of these experimental projects. Because on the one hand, experimentation allows us to foresee the threats and complications that the implementation could have. And on the other hand, drive us to debate on the nature and functioning of our welfare states and our social policies. Based on the current context, I think this is quite a lot. Thank you so much.
Ja, doncs, si us sembla, passem a les preguntes.
If you like, we can move on to our Q&A segment of the session. We have time for some questions from the audience.
Can I do it in English? It's okay? English, see? Okay. I have a question for Bru. Actually, I have two questions for Bru. First one, and I'm sorry if I misunderstood. I mean, I can sort of understand Catalan a bit, but maybe not everything. So I heard you talk about Iran and I heard you talk about Marika. And it looked to me like you're talking about them as if they are experiments and pilot schemes. They are not. They're actually existing policies. I mean, of course, the Iran one got cancelled, but was never meant to be an experiment. It was an actual policy. And Marika at the moment is still ongoing, is being evaluated, but it's a policy that's very fundamentally different from a pilot scheme and from an experiment scheme. So I just kind of wanted to raise that and to see whether I understood you correctly or not. And a second, just a very brief comment. So I share a lot of your views on basic income experiments being not necessary, but useful in all sorts of ways. But my take on this is that at the end of the day, at the moment, when we're talking policy development, experiments are the only game in town, right? So if the Finnish government comes to you and says, you can either have an experiment or you can't, or you have nothing, what do? You say, yes, please, thanks, give us the experiment. I imagine the same applies to the Catalan government. The same applies to the Irish government, you know, that launched a government program like the Finnish, basically saying we're going to do an experiment. Okay, so this is the reality, the political reality, which is no one wants to go and implement the basic income. So either we stay and discuss things amongst ourselves in a basement or in a nice room like this, or we do something concrete and we make it the best we can have. But it's the only game in town. So why are we even discussing necessary or useful or not? Is that actually really an interesting question? Or should we just move on and say, experiments, they're here, let's make them as best as possible given what we want to get out of them?
Responent així ràpid?
Sí, no?
Sí. Ok, perfecte. Molt ràpidament, sí, tota la raó, la diferenciació entre el cas d'Iran i d'Americà, un és una política, l'altre és un projecte pilot. Sí, això em referia de que tractava indistintament o dintre el mateix sac.
What I meant is that pilot experiments and policies, almost experimental policies, were considered on the same grounds. I don't think it's a good policy, but in terms of economy, in my presentation, I decided to do it this way, but I share this difference. In the case of Finland, I agree that I don't deny the benefits an experiment could provide, and in the event this is carried out, I will always choose a scenario where this can be carried out, police or an innovative policy. But I just wanted to highlight with my example from Finland is that the political implications that these experiments could have in favor or against basic income, just this political dimension that goes beyond the scientific and neutral implications of a pilot. One question for Lluís Torrens, Arcarons. You talked about tax data that allow us to capture the highest income strata, and that causes the inequality to increase. If we could be able to capture the informal economy, how do you think these equality reports could vary and affect the implementation of these basic income policies? It's hard to give you an answer, especially to the first part of the question, because this informal economy is not know that we'll have data. We just could give you estimates or forecasts on the impact this could have. It is complicated, but it's clear, talking about the differences between the two types of information, is at least when I gave my presentation, I didn't wanted to say that the tax sample is better than the living conditions survey. I didn't mean that. This survey doesn't provide a lot of information, but it includes other aspects that are not considered by tax information. But in order to measure the impact of basic income, we think that it's more useful to use the tax information than that of the survey. Well, I think this is related to the recommendation by the committee of experts in their white paper that says that everybody should provide a tax statement, which it should be compulsory if you want to have minimum income. There's 9 million people here that are outside the tax radar of the state. So making it compulsory to provide a tax statement and at the same time have a basic scheme, you immediately would see who is eligible and who is not. Maybe there's someone who prefers to be out of the radar because they have debts or other things, and they would prefer to not to have this income. There are several situations where someone would be out of the radar, but I think the first step should be this tax rate of 44% incentivates certain things and disincentivates others. So the second calculation is to try to find a lower rate for a first range of the population that allows a lower taxation for this segment. But I think that we need to have a minimum tax rate so that everybody contributes to this model, because everyone will be receiving a citizen salary and everyone needs to contribute and be co-responsible. And later we can discuss other models such as the one of Portugal, where you can deduct a part of your invoices, etc., or expensive. But I think the first measure is that everyone is included in the under this taxation radar. Any other questions? My question is an economical one. How is this related to contributive pensions? In economical terms, I wanted to ask how this is related to receiving this income is related to contributive pensions, such as pensions received by the elderly, maybe with other sorts of supports around or subsidies throughout your life cycle, such as grants, or maybe this could be a source of funding for a basic income. We didn't have to explain the part of what we wanted to say of our model. We talk about savings in our model, and we contemplate several situations. The results we are presenting today, there's a saving where contributive pensions and employment benefits are assumed under basic income up to the amount established as the minimum threshold, and the rest will be considered as it is done now. we have contemplated other models where we include pensions and employment benefits within the basic income contribution. The results tell us that these increases on average by 4 or 5 points the tax rates we should be applying for the model to be sustainable in terms of funding. In this second case, what we do is that non-contributive pensions are clearly undertaken by the basic income, and this means that a part of the grants and subsidies to families would be the same. They would be undertaken under the basic income because these subsidies exceeds the basic income we're talking about. I would like to go back to the debate we were having between Jürgen and Bru. We're trying to interpret your contribution on this point. My question is for Bru, but it's based on what Jürgen said. I think it is what Jürgen was saying is reasonable, but having a political will is not a dichotomy. Either there is no will or we have a country with a political will, strong political will to implement this basic income tomorrow. We have been experimenting in the last 10, 20, 15 years increase of the social base. Some surveys show us this, and we cannot say that all left-wing parties are for this basic income, but there's a level of debate that has been changing. But my question is that whether or not you're sending a warning to society and institutions that are funding you, that we should accept this commission, but go one step beyond, not just do a pilot that we understand as a scientific tool to learn a lot of things, but also as an advocacy tool. Getting closer to this basic income. I think that the office, they have not been committed with implementing the basic income, but to do a pilot. But I think also that there is a political debate here that frames what Bru was saying. I'm just interpreting what you have in your head. Maybe you should tell us directly, but
razonable que plantees lo que has planteado, pero entiendo
it makes sense that you say what you say, but I think Bru was saying, because what I was mentioning, going back to the question by Jürgen or the remark by Jürgen, and also your comments, David, my intervention is motivated. Maybe you want to answer this. I was giving a speech in Tarragona, and someone asked, what real possibilities are there that we could have a basic income? Are you asking me that the possibilities are zero? But I expect there are some possibilities. But why are you asking me? I'm here just as someone who knows something about experiments and public policies, but I cannot give you an answer. What I mean is that experiments can have a public usefulness, and I think they have. They can have also a political usefulness that could be beneficial to a scenario where there is a basic income, but also negative impact because it get us farther from this horizon we would like to see. But they don't have the usefulness or the responsibility. And maybe I should have asked this guy, how can you ensure that we could have a basic income? My job here is not to make this a reality as a scientist or researcher. My responsibility or the responsibility of basic income depends on the social movements, the politicians, the think tanks, and other entities and associations. And even the scouts, I don't know if they have anything to do with this, but okay. Congratulations for your presentations. They've been really interesting. You have provided a lot of information, and we hope we can digest it. Well, it's been very interesting, and all the questions and the debate has been interesting. It is a commonplace debate. We've been talking about this many times, and one of the things that I think are important in this process is the debate we will be generating along the way, and the communication on basic income. We will be doing a fundamental aspect in this respect is that the advisory committee of the pilot scheme has tried to make it a sample of this diversity of stakeholders and social society, civil society we have in favor of basic income. We have people here, representatives of this committee, that have signed manifestos during the pandemic in favor of basic income, social workers, for social workers, and the LGBT plus movement, people from the culture industry, people with involved in the mental health sector, and also the third sector in Catalonia, that in recent years have been taking a stance in favor of a basic income, such as the Catalan entity of social action, ECAS, that hosted a workshop on basic income in February. And also members of the academy, such as Jordi Arcarons or Lamat, and Daniel Raventos, and other activists. We've wanted that the advisory committee includes all these voices, and this, I think, this needs to generate this debate around the pilot schemes. We have a unique opportunity provided by the government of Catalonia to assess a pilot scheme, to see the impact, and to communicate and debate this proposal as a proposal that goes beyond all the policies, conditioned policies we are seeing that haven't had any success or possibility to guarantee the material existence of the citizens. Any other questions?
Yo también quiero relacionarme un poco con.
I would like to comment on the debate started by Bru. I think your perspective is very ingenious, starting from the fact that when a pilot scheme might not be that necessary, but it can be useful regarding a basic income. And I agree that there's a scientific usefulness and also a political one. But as you said, behind every social policy, there's an ethical justification. So if we are all against inequalities, in principle, any social policy that is more redistributive or more inclusive should have this ethical support. And here, I don't think it is this perspective you had on whether or not they are not necessary but useful. You need to provide greater justification that this method is necessary and useful at the same time, because there is an ethical justification behind that should have prevalence. And on top of that, experiments, if social policy is going to reduce in socioeconomical inequalities, with a social policy, you cannot focus the human behavior, and the experiment allows you to foresee this human behavior against a specific social measure. And this is not something to be ignored. An experiment could provide greater knowledge regarding the response and the reactions of human beings, and provide us with greater arguments against any possible criticism these policies could receive. I don't know if I made myself clear. I wanted to speak in Catalan, but I wasn't able. Two quick considerations, please. First of all, thank you for congratulating us, but being honest, I'm not ingenious. I'm just been gathering something that's been said before by others. Just quickly, what I wanted to say is that there is a political usefulness in experiments, basically because there's epistemological and scientific support behind. This doesn't mean that this political usefulness backed up by scientific usefulness is less than the political usefulness of a campaign by the trade unions or political parties or the mass media.
La campaña que en nuestro día a día, de forma particular y en nuestro ámbito doméstico, hacemos cada día comiéndole la oreja a nuestra abuela, como hago yo.
So when every day we talk to our people, the people around us, and this gets disseminated among elderly people, for example, so I use every opportunity I can to disseminate the message. And maybe this has a higher political usefulness, because sometimes when you organize like a campaign, well, the outreach is not so big. And so yes, my goal was to try and say which might be the political usefulness of those experiments. Of course, there are other dynamics in other fora, in other spaces, as well, what I do with my people around me and elderly people around me. I have a question about the quantity. So I did not understand the quantity received in terms of basic income is related to the people that you live with. I don't understand why an individual living alone would get one amount and why other people living with other people would get another amount. It is related to the definition of the poverty threshold. The threshold, the poverty threshold, is determined depending on the composition of the household. It is not depending on whether you live alone or with many people, etc. So, in this sense, here we have presented a potential example of a funding model for the basic income. As we said, there will be 3 or 4 more others, and 3, for example, are related to individual situations. The option number 2 I think that's the one that you have in this material that has been handed out to you. This is an individual model saying to each individual, well, each individual can get 900 euros, and if you are a single parent, also 900, but and also the minors can receive half of that or something like that. So this is another model. And so this has impact on the funding, the cost, etc. But when we talk about a model where the quantity is assigned or allocated to the household, as we have justified, what we say is that the quantity that is allocated to the household is split amongst all the members of that household. Why do we say that this quantity is assigned to the household? Because the poverty threshold is defined based on that. So it is defined according to the composition of each household. Excuse me, but the document that he mentioned, you have it, don't you? You have it in your folder, but it is also uploaded on the website. So for people following us from home, this is a public document and it is on our website. But the method is exactly the same. Yes, just to complete. So when we will assess the pilot scheme, for example, if we implement some of these measures, one of the measures will be to say, those people taking part in this pilot scheme, so have they quit poverty? Of course. Yes. And if you use other criteria, you will have different results. But the criteria that we have now is an international criteria. This is an OECD criteria. So for an adult, 100%, the other adults, 50% until 14 years old. And, well, that's the criteria that is used in Spain and in Europe, or in Catalonia, to calculate who's below and who's above the risk of poverty. Of course, you can then have other privations and you can be poor. And there are many, many situations in a city of, such as Barcelona, that poverty depends a lot on the cost of housing. But, well, there are different configurations. And so the housing cost, for example, is lower when there are more people in the household as compared to when someone lives alone. Hello, and congratulations for this seminar. I think that it is necessary to step forward and to start presenting this first pilot scheme on basic income. I think that we need to be realistic here, and I believe that we should make some political learnings. I wanted to say something technical, but I will start with politics because this discussion that we have opened up here is more political. I think that we should be more critical about the process that we followed with the guaranteed income for citizens. There was a whole process, a whole mobilization, but then the result was not so good. And I think that these are political learnings that are very important, and we should keep them high in our political agenda, because the future will also be impacted by these results. Having said that, and following what you were just saying, I understand that the starting point, or let's say there is a double dimension about the conditionality when talking about this basic income. On the one hand, there is the fact that the fact of being beneficiary stems from the fact of being a citizen and not from being active in the labor market. So when we talk about conditionality, that's important. You don't need to be active on the employment market to have access to this benefit. But then there is another condition which is more technical, which is less political, which is that you have to show to me that you are doing something to have the right to have this benefit. These are two dimensions that sometimes are mixed up in the discussion, and I think that we should separate them. About the guaranteed income for citizens, it does not reject the fact of being active on the employment market. So this is one of the main limitations, I think, of it. And in this case, this has been set aside with people younger than 23 years old, for example. So this is one of the first aspects of this learning that we should take for the future. To what extent are we capable of thinking of a pilot scheme, which is important in terms of the emancipation process of people in Catalonia? And then, in this same sense, about the amounts and the scale economies, I believe that the poverty threshold is in Catalonia. I mean, you are referring to the one in Catalonia, not in the the threshold in Spain, because in Spain it's higher than in Catalonia. Okay, great. And then about the scale economies, I believe that, well, probably I believe that we would need to do a better analysis. We should really see whether the scale economies are the actual scale economies that we see in households. Why am I saying that? Because if we refer to the reference salaries or the reference budgets, for example, in the parenting costs, UNICEF and another study here in Barcelona say that this is 600 euros, the cost of parenting a child. And if we include another child in the household's expenditures, we are talking about 300 euros more. So this is not 0.3. This would be the OECD equivalent scale, but this is almost 0.5. So I believe that this is a first technical discussion that we would need to have. And linked to that, if this is a right that stems from the fact of being a citizen, so if it is universal, how this is finally diluted into the family structure? Maybe we should take complete households and then assign to them a basic income to each of the members to see which is the effect, the actual effect on the household and on the household behavior. Because if not, what we're doing is we are giving this benefit by weighing the different members. And so we are saying, okay, if we allocate this to the mother because she has a child and so she will be more freer and she will be emancipating, etc. So I think that the household can a little bit disrupt the individual effects that we might have. Now, about the studies that you presented, I would like to say that UNICEF has also conducted some studies showing that reduced VAT is the main benefit in families. More than any other type of reductions, this is the main benefit for households. Why? Because the expenditure structure that households have, it's true that in some scale economies, as Lluís said, this is different. But of course, they also need a bigger house, and they use more electricity, etc. And to finish, I believe that it is important to have a reform of this guaranteed income for citizens that would make it compatible with other benefits. And going back to the political issue, this is an after-the-fact policy. Why I'm saying that? Because when we consider the value of a pilot scheme on a basic income model, we will have to say, look, this is the added value as compared to other contributions by other benefits. So we could say, okay, instead of having this basic income pilot scheme, we will modify the guaranteed income for citizens regulation, and there maybe part of the people, I mean, we will be able to analyze things differently depending on the type of people that we have. And now I'm actually finishing. Do you consider having different amounts depending on, for example, the living costs, as Lluís said, on the different territories? Because at the end of the day, 500 euros in Barcelona is not the same as another place, and also in terms of age or under some conditions. So those people that already have paid housing, or people of a certain age, well, maybe the quantities could be variable, as it is the case in other benefits. I know this is a very complex discussion, but well, these are some ideas that I want to offer to you. If you want to answer these questions and we finish, here we need to close.
Sí, per casa també, per la transmissió.
Sorry, but we're not here. Yeah, Emilia Macho, I'm the sub-director of the guaranteed income for citizens, and I don't agree with the fact that people with 18 years old are excluded. They are not excluded. There are different criteria in this model, so young people are not completely excluded. So I don't agree on that point. And then I would like to say that there is a commission that was created with the implementation of this guaranteed income model, and 2 months ago we created a working group, and what we are doing, because there are members of different departments and other social partners and the third sector entities, and what we will do is to try and modify the law and the regulation to see. Well, we will now update the data, and so we made some recommendations, as many other entities. So we did some proposals to improve this model and to include other benefits, partial time, etc. So that's what we are up to now, and in this this working group will be meeting every 2 weeks, and the intention is to improve this guaranteed income for citizens, to see how, with all the reports by Evalua and others, how we can make it more accessible so that it reaches everyone. Thank you.
Eloi, crec que anem una mica justos.
Yes, we don't have time. I took note of what you said, and so I invite you tomorrow to ask these questions again, because we will have more time tomorrow to analyze all the points that you said, because you said really a lot of things. So since we don't have time, I would suggest that we go back to that point tomorrow. So we said we should have finished 20 minutes ago. So please, if you don't have any other questions, we should finish here.
En faré una molt ràpida o potser en podrem parlar a la tarda, que també
A
parlarem
very
de
quick
xifres.
question, or maybe we will talk about that later, but Lluís mentioned the point about housing, and this is something that I also considered before, because other studies have shown that when there have been direct benefits, so direct economic benefits, one of the results was that the prices increased. So finally that went into the hands of the private sector. I think that this will need to be included in the assessment or the impacts, because if we do not control these housing policies and on prices, and housing is in the hands of the private sector, we can face that risk, the risk that part of these benefits go in the hands of owners, or maybe an element which is quite impoverishing. This could remain an element for impoverishment. Okay, that's for later maybe. Okay. Thank you very much for your participation and see you later. Thank you.